It's currently 1 a.m. because I honestly forgot about this, but I'm doing my video on period poverty. Period poverty is an aspect of sexual and reproductive health issues globally. Developed and most parts of developing countries have access to things such as pads, tampons, and menstrual cups, whereas undeveloped countries do not. I like how you can't see my face. People in poverty have limited access to these products, causing them to use cloths and rags. Just stick them in your underwear and call it a day. Or some people roll them up and stick them up. In the short documentary I watched, there were citizens of rural India talking about how they use whatever they can find, clean or dirty. Not a good idea, guys. That causes yeast infections. Nobody wants a yeast infection. Living in poverty means limited access to education, particularly on women's reproductive health and menstruation. There were men of all ages, such as teenagers and like old as men, and they were interviewed in rural India, and none of them knew what a freaking period was. Sir, how do you miss that? Using rags and cloths caused lots of women to drop out of school because it became too difficult for them to run off the school campus or whatever, change their little cloth situation and come back, because periods are considered a dirty thing in rural India anyway. And so they felt ashamed to change where anyone could see them. Obviously that's never fun. They felt it became too difficult for them, so they just quit school. Their spiritual well-being is negatively affected because that means that they just said goodbye to any future well-ish paying job, continuing the cycle of poverty. I forgot to talk about strategy. So for years the world has been begging for sanitary products to be free of charge because they are obviously a necessity to women all across the world. But the companies that make these refuse.
My name is Revati, and I will be going over how poverty affects life expectancy. So the countries with the highest life expectancy are countries like Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, and Spain, and the countries with the lowest life expectancy include countries like the Central African Republic, Chad, Nigeria, Sierra Leone. In fact, most countries in Africa have a very low life expectancy compared to the rest of the world, as it can be noted that countries that are quite poverty-stricken have a low life expectancy due to things such as lack of education, which would lead to very few job opportunities, poor nutrition because if our bodies don't have enough food and or adequate variation in the food that is consumed, it can lead to people getting sick as their bodies are lacking something that is needed to function. Add this to the fact that impoverished countries also don't have adequate healthcare and or housing, and it would make sense that drought or disease or things along those lines tend to hit regions in poverty harder than regions or countries that are doing well. Thus, life expectancy of impoverished countries drops.
I'm doing political influences on poverty. So the top three are political instability, poor governments, and corruption. Political instability is when there's not enough time for effective actions to be taken in the benefit of the citizens. So there's such a short time span and the government is changing so much that nothing is done to actually benefit those in need or to take actions at all, like bills and laws. Poor governments is basically you have a government, but they're terrible and they're doing nothing, which is so the poor aren't getting the attention they need, all the services or funding that is required, meaning, the quality of those services declines, and who relies on those services the most? The poor. Corruption. Basically the government is sifting the money through their own fingers, taking a little bit out, cherry picking who they give it to. So yeah, they're corrupt. which means those in the lower levels of the class system, the poor, those in those socioeconomic areas, they are given the least amount of attention or funding, which is very important, funding, because imagine if we didn't get the benefits, what would happen? Like, the poor are already in such a bad position. What happens when you take away the floor underneath their feet? An example of this is Haiti. So that's a country in the Western Hemisphere. It's actually the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And that's because of the political turmoil and the lack of governance caused by misuse of funds and corruption. This means that the public service quality declines, which also in turn means that the fundamental services such as the justice system or the police also declines. So discrimination increases, the poverty cycle is even harder to get out of, because what do you do when you're faced with problems? Usually you go to someone, but if those services aren't even there anymore, you're just stuck fending for yourself, which is a lot of what the Haitians are feeling right now. I hope I said that word right. So it's a harsh climate for breaking out the poverty cycle. Those are the political influences. Thank you.
I'm doing groups and organizations that help to prevent poverty, and the first organization that I found was UNICEF, which helps children who are forced into marriage at a young age, which is often due to poverty. To help and prevent this, they launched their global program to end child marriage. It empowers young girls at risk or already in union, and has already reached more than 12 million adolescent girls with life skills training and school attendance support since 2016. Over 105 million people have engaged in dialogue and communication campaigns to support adolescent girls or other efforts to end child marriage. Their program also tackles child marriage in 12 of the most high-burden countries. Another good organization that I found is Save the Children, and their projects involve entire communities to combat poverty in efforts of stopping the poverty cycle. They aim to improve children's lives by focusing on child labor, emergencies, poverty, education, and health. They also work in 120 countries, also including New Zealand, and help by taking donations from people to help families and communities get out of the poverty cycle by providing essentials like food, water, shelter, and other essential items for education, like opening school buildings and giving children books and essentials that they need for their education. Some other good organizations that I found were the Hunger Project, Oxfam, and World Vision.